Irvin Muchnick is a concussion expert. He's the author of Chris and Nancy, the true story of the Benoit murder, suicide, and pro wrestling's cocktail of death, and is currently working on another book involving sport and concussions. And he joins us right now. Irv, thank you very much for your time.
Well, Jim, it's good to be back. It's not happy to be facing another individual tragedy, but people do need to understand that this story is not going to go away. And now that NHL and NFL players are starting to drop dead young at a rate approaching that of WWE wrestlers, maybe people will start taking it seriously.
Do we have, and it's hard to jump to a conclusion to say that it was, necessarily linked with this player, although he was an enforcer and did a lot of fighting in the NHL. Do we have enough information about the brain to say that concussions are definitively linked to depression and that kind of stuff?
Oh, absolutely enough to say that it's definitively linked to depression in a general way. In individual cases, there are a million stories in the naked city. I mean, there are going to be people who are dying because of general depression, and we need to be lifting society taboos about talking about that subject and about mental illness in general. But to the extent that there is evidence that repeated blows to the head in contact sports, like pro football, like professional hockey, like professional wrestling, is leading to a syndrome identical to that in boxing, and they call it chronic traumatic encephalopathy. The answer to your question is yes.
So we know the NFL, and you follow the NFL a little bit more than you follow the NHL, but we know that the NFL, wouldn't have a product if it was flag football or touch football, which would effectively eliminate any chance of having a concussion. Sure, there are late hits, but there are also legitimate hits, which are going to, unfortunately, result in concussion. The same could be said about hockey. You can never get it to a point where there won't be concussions because, whether it's a late hit, a player can turn at the last moment, and then it becomes a dirty hit, but somebody's already committed in terms of the move. But we can get rid of fighting in hockey. We can get rid of fighting. And we had a guy quote a concussion doctor who said that probably 1 in 4 fights results in a concussion. I mean, that's something that is controllable. In the NFL, you've just been following the new players agreement. What have they done to kind of change and address these issues with the players?
Well, I don't think anything substantial at all, Jim. They did set up a legacy fund, which is supposedly going to increase pension and disability benefits to retired players, some of whom are Hall of Fame legends, getting monthly checks of $176 a month from the $9 billion a year National Football League. This is outrageous, and that's wrong. But I want to get to what I think is the root issue in all this. I agree with everything that you've said, but the real problem is that pro football, for example, is not sustainable if at the amateur level they have to start training people to do the crazy things that million-dollar professionals have to do to entertain masses on television and in large stadiums.
What does that mean?
Football is just too hot not to cool down. I believe that what's happening is the beginning of a process that's going to reduce football in a way that boxing was in an earlier era. There's a talk show host in Chicago named Dan Bernstein who I think puts it very well. If you don't let your child box, you shouldn't let them play tackle football at a young age. And perhaps the same is true of hockey as well.
Well, we know that with the appetite for, football in North America, hockey, especially in Canada, that a guy like Wade Belak, who fought 136 times in his 14-year NHL career. And if we're to believe the doctor, who's a concussion expert, that 1 in 4 fights results in some form of a concussion, then a guy who fought 136 times, I mean, if we have to buy into that number, that's pretty troubling. And I would say that when you stand up and cheer at a hockey game, and I'm one of them, when these fights happen, what are we doing to these guys? I mean, they're getting compensated very generously, but I mean, I think that's got to make you feel differently about the sport condoning that kind of activity.
Oh, absolutely. But I don't want to get bogged down in the technicalities, but I think it's kind of a coincidence that these 3 recent hockey deaths are all enforcers or policemen who've gotten a lot of fights. Because I don't think fights per se is the issue. It doesn't help, don't get me wrong. But what the evidence is showing is that the accumulation of concussive and subconcussive blows, which have nothing to do with fighting, which have everything to do with the basic, fundamental nature of the sport as it is legally played, those are the things that are causing this cumulative and insidious brain damage that is becoming an epidemic in the youth of America, and I think is going to be evidenced in, as we start studying reduced academic achievement, increased violent criminal behavior, and things of that, and reduced workforce productivity. I think this is where the rubber hits the road for fans who just like to say, "I want my candy." They have to think about whether the hyper-commercial values of big-time professional sports are trickling down into every layer of our society in public schools and high school football, and what we need to be doing about that.
I would agree. Irv, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Jim.
Irv Muchnick, a concussion expert and the author of Chris and Nancy, the true story of the Benoit murder and suicide and pro wrestling's cocktail of death, and also working on an NFL book of the same ilk.